Welcome back. Today we published Chapter 5, Lactate Testing Essentials. So similar to what I did with the Training Zones chapter, Chapter 4, rather than read it out to you, you can read it for yourself, I'm going to highlight the key points and emphasize how you apply the information that John and I have taken the time to write out for you. We have tried to put everything you're going to need to test and interpret your test in a single location for you. So if there's any gaps or you have further questions, reach out. We're happy to offer ideas because we want to make this chapter as good as we can make it. So let's dig in. We're going to shrink me down. And what I did was I brought out some of my gear. Actually, will blow me back up so you can see a couple things. So here's my kit. Lactate Plus Analyzer by Nova Biomedicals. And when I'm testing myself, I use this lancet here. And the little lancets that it comes with, these little things right here, sometimes the gauge can be too small. And if you're not getting a good drop, you might have to size it up. And I use a 28 gauge. Another trick that John Hellemans recommends is you could pull this out a little bit. Don't push it in all the way, and that might help you if you find that you're with an athlete and you're not getting a good enough sample. Sometimes when the hands are cold, early in the test, heart rate is down, the blood will be slow to come out. Now, some other things I like. Wash the hands before testing, both the tester and the athlete. Make sure you get all the soapy residue off. And then once the test is underway, if you're getting sweaty and kind of sticky, I use just these alcohol prep pads. They're sort of 1x1 pads. And before I sample, I'll kind of clean up all my fingertips and then wait for a bit for the alcohol to evaporate. I never test the first drop. So I'm usually testing the third drop. So I'm wiping it away and I wipe it onto, John likes to use towels. I got this non-sterile, non-woven dental gauze, 2x2, 4-ply. Got it on Amazon. It's cheap, works well for me, and then I don't have blood all over my towels. Now, if you're testing someone other than yourself, or you are, say you're at the track and you're testing multiple athletes at the same time, trying to keep track of an individual athlete's lancet is difficult. And they have these things, safety lancets. You can get them on Amazon, pressure activated, and you get 100 in a pack, and you just take the top off and you just squeeze it and it'll pop. And they're easy, and you'll never cross-contaminate anyone when you're using these. So that's a good thing to have. So that's a bit on the gear. Now we will shrink me back down, and we will get into the next section. So sampling technique. So some of your lactate analyzers are going to require calibration. If they do, there's going to be a calibration chip inside the box of strips that you get. And you just are going to have to make sure that you've got the right chip in the analyzer. So the Edge analyzer requires that, but the Nova biomedical analyzer does not require calibration. The other thing the Nova analyzer lets you do is it samples at the tip, whereas the Edge samples in a notch on the side of the strip. And if you're using the tip, you're able to break the surface tension of the drop of blood, and it'll soak that blood up into the strip. And I find that's a little bit easier. The other thing I like about the Nova analyzer is you get a result in 13 seconds. So if the sample is bad, or if the output is suspect, you can turn it around really quick. And when you get your sampling technique down, you can actually get 2 or sometimes even 3 samples within a minute, a really narrow time frame. The other thing is, if you're doing a progressive test, say you're on the bike, don't up the wattage until you're sure you've got a good reading. And the quick sampling of the Nova machine makes that a lot easier for you. Okay. Where to test? So something many of you will notice is, particularly if you're riding indoors versus outdoors, is that heart rate, perceived exertion, and even power are different indoors versus outdoors. And the riding style is different too, depending on your trainer. Sometimes you can't move the bike, which is useful for different styles of riding. So something to think about is, where are you going to want to apply the testing data? You're going to apply it out in the field. You're going to apply it indoors. If you do a lot of indoor training, testing indoors makes a lot of sense as well. Testing indoors is much easier. The bike's not moving anywhere. You can set things up beside your treadmill. Much more straightforward. But if you're outside, a little more difficult, but you can set up a circuit, either a trail circuit or a loop circuit, and it's much more applicable. You can have the athlete ride to heart rate or power or effort and drop by this little testing station that you've set up, and you can get much more practical field data. And so that's something for you to think about, where you're going to be doing those tests. And if you do test indoors and then go outdoors to apply it, you're going to need to be careful, because the heart rate response might be different. Perceived exertion might be different. So pay attention to that and be willing to do spot checks. So sometimes people will take those the lab data, and they'll do spot checks, running at the track, riding at the velodrome, to give them an opportunity to kind of dial it in more accurately. Okay. Fed or fasted? This comes up a lot. When should I eat? I've actually found with myself, I've been doing a ton of testing on myself over the last 2 years, that it doesn't make much of a difference, providing you start the test at a low enough power or pace so that if there's any elevated lactate as a result of eating close to the test, it has time to kind of wash out and the baseline is going to descend. Now, if you want to really do it precise, the best thing to do is just eat your normal meal 2 hours before you test. But I like to do Submax testing in the morning when I wake up, and I don't necessarily want to wake up 2 hours early to eat a breakfast before I do my Submax testing. And I've experimented with fasted testing, fed testing, the 2 hour gap. And by the time I'm a half hour into a nice, easy warm up, everything kind of washes out. The other thing is, if you're an athlete that has a certain style of eating versus training, you might just want to try that. Just do your normal endurance workout with your normal feeding pattern and see what happens. See what your profile looks like. Check your baseline. See what you're like at the start. See what you're like after the warm-up, and try and learn your individual profile. Okay, testing protocols. So 2 main tests. There is a Submax test, and the purpose of the Submax test is to dial in this first lactate threshold. And we've defined that as the lowest point or range that you see as you're moving along this baseline easy effort. And that point before the lactate ticks up is going to be the top of zone 1. And so you're going to want to use relatively small steps and 10-minute steps as well. So it's going to give you a nice look. And then when you think you've dialed in that LT1 point, what I recommend you do is a different day, or if you're feeling good, you can do it right after, is you sit on that pace or that power for a long block. And what do I mean by long? 40 minutes plus. And you do spot checks, and the spot checks can confirm if you're actually you remain at this baseline level. The other test, 5-minute steps, slightly larger step heights. And what you want to ensure is you get at least 3 steps in easy, zone 1. I will do up to 5 steps. I will start really easy. And make sure when you map out your test that you're going to get a look everywhere you think, every zone you think. So the steps, you don't want to step across a zone. So you're going to have this long baseline, a look at zone 2, a look at zone 3, a look at zone 4, maybe 4 plus, and then the final step's going to be zone 5. So look at those and give some thought to the paces and the power that you're going to be using. And remember, you're going to want to use the same step height as you repeat the test year in, year out. So I've been using 5-minute steps, 25 watts since I was an age grouper and then an elite, and now I'm a vet athlete. And it gives me a big data set that I can look at over time. Now, with these different protocols, know if you change the step height, or you change the step duration, or the environmental conditions, the temperature, your fatigue, the altitude you're at, all these different things, they will influence the kinetics of the test. And what I mean by that, the heart rate response, the lactate response, all these different factors. So what we're looking for, just because we're drawing blood and writing numbers down on the paper, don't assume that we are getting precision. What we're looking for is enough accuracy to make informed training decisions. So remember that. It's also why it pays to get your own kit so that you can do these spot checks and you can learn your individual profile. And if something feels out of whack relative to what you're seeing in terms of the watts or the pace, you can do spot checks anytime you want because you got your kit and you can just say, hey, what's up? And when you do that, I recommend you take your baseline and always take a sample after you warm up too, so you can see the changes. Because remember, the nominal value, so 2 millimoles, 1 millimole, you'll have your own meaning to those nominal values. So my 2 millimole effort is not necessarily the same as another athlete's 2 millimole effort. So bear that in mind too. Now, if you're looking to target your zone 5 training, the easiest starting point for that is the last 5-minute power or pace of the full profile test. So it's that last step. That's going to give you a useful starting point for that kind of effort. Okay, we chatted about baseline and LT1. Be aware that baseline that you will hear and read in the literature is often undefined. They will just say baseline. So when we talk about baseline, we talk about the lowest point that it goes down to. And I did a test this morning and my out of bed baseline, so my wake up baseline was 0.6. And then I started exercising and my baseline immediately went to 1.2. And I would use that 1.2 value as my baseline, not the 0.6. So I was going, I rode my bike for a half hour with my heart rate under 100 beats per minute, ate a couple bananas, had a little bit of water, and then I sampled my baseline because I knew I wanted to do a long aerobic climb with spot checks and I wanted to get that baseline, not the out of bed baseline. So something to bear in mind. Okay. Second threshold. Now again, the easiest, if you look at this chart, this is me, this is my elite profile here, you can see that it kind of goes to this point here with this sort of yellow circle. So that's the first lactate threshold, okay? Because lactate ticks up. So the first material uptick after baseline. And then you see the slope is staying relatively constant until the slope changes. And that point where the slope changes, if you can see it, that would be the second lactate threshold. Now, you don't always get these nice inflection points. And we're going to talk about that a little later in the seminar. This is what we call a normal curve. But the normal curve isn't normal, as we'll cover later. So if you don't have a normal curve, what you do is you take this first lactate threshold point and you draw a line to the end of the test. Okay? And then you look for the point along the curve, the lactate curve, that is furthest from this line that you drew. And that's going to be an estimate of the second lactate threshold. Now be aware, it's probably an overestimate. So for most every athlete that I work with, if you use these short steps or even a 20-minute test, it tends to overestimate what we're going to actually see if this athlete does a best hour out in the field. So as a result, remember what we said in the zone seminar, we said be willing to undershoot. So this point that we are going to derive either from the second change in slope there, where it kicks up, or using this modified Dmax, max distance method, where we draw the line, is an estimate. And we're going to be willing to sit under the estimate. We're not going to try and sit at or slightly over. We're going to be conservative in our application. And if you're a new athlete, I would recommend being very conservative. And your threshold training, I would target in between the first lactate threshold and the second lactate threshold, that midpoint, which is going to be a tempo effort that we discussed in the training zone seminar as well. Okay, so let's slide forward. Now, determining heart rate zones. So again, let's picture a typical situation if you're self-testing. You're going to be in your garage maybe, or it's early morning at the track, or you're in your basement on your indoor trainer. It's probably going to be cool out. You might be relatively fresh. It might be the first day of the microcycle, or perhaps you're fatigued. It's the 5th day of your microcycle. The fatigue will impact the heart rate response that you get. So as a result, 2 things that I want you to remember. First is skew errors left. And if you remember that curve we plotted, so if you're unsure, be a little conservative with where you're placing these thresholds, as well as the heart rate that you're going to use to apply to that threshold. And then when you apply in the field, be willing to undershoot. And what I mean by that is, if we take, for example, let's just slide up, and we take this point here. This is 200 watts, and the heart rate associated with that in this test looks like it's about 120 beats. Now, if we take that from the test and we apply it out in the field on a hot day, we're going to see a much greater heart rate response. The other thing that we're going to see is to average 200 watts. We're actually going to need to be sitting above 200 quite a bit of time. And if you look at a plot of your power bins in 25 watt segments, you'll be able to see that. So as a result, we need to be willing to undershoot. So don't try and get a precise LT1 average. And if you find that your green zone training is making you feel really tired, you're probably nudging up in the green zone. And as a result, you're going up, you're doing all these little surges up into zone 3, and sometimes even up into zone 4 or zone 5. And as a result, these micro surges make the workout much more fatiguing. So aim lower in zone 1 for that training. And last year, I did a lot of training that was lower. And by lower, my LT1 was 200. I was averaging 165 watts, just to give you a bit of a feel for that. And that kept it nice and comfortable when I was seeking those very specific metabolic type adaptations. So what we have here at Run Test is a sort of balance. It's a data table. I want to show you the sort of things that I put in there. So I got kilometers per hour, my pace in terms of minutes and seconds per kilometer, the lactate reading, the heart rate max for each step, and then the score, the subjective perception score. The subjective perception score is going to be important when you convert these powers and paces into zones for yourself. And half points are allowed. So if you say, something can feel like a zone 2.5 or zone 3.5, we'll do a case study with that a little bit later. Submax test here, only took it to a 3 out of 5. Lactate 2.7, which was a little over 1 millimole above baseline. So it took it up to about a zone 3 effort this time. Now, setting off of this run test, okay? So this one's actually pretty clear. There is a range of baseline. So if you see that, from 10 kilometers per hour up to 13 kilometers per hour, lactate is hovering 1.4 to 1.5. And then it ticks up significantly. It's a big tick once I go past. Now, these steps were 10-minute steps. And so a bigger heart rate response with a 10-minute step than with a 5-minute step. So looking at this test, I would not set my zone 1 at this final point of baseline. The reason being is the RPE score was a zone 2. So I would set zone 1 where it was still a 1 out of 5 on the subjective perception. So it's really important for you as an athlete that's self-testing or as a coach or a clinician that's testing to get that RPE in the final minute of each step before the athlete gets to see the lactate value. You don't want to skew their thoughts. And when we were testing down in New Zealand, when John was teaching me this method, sometimes they wouldn't even let me see the heart rate. I would have to go completely on feel when someone else was testing me. And they'd just be sitting there with a clipboard, and we would be sampling. We'd be writing the heart rate on every minute. And then we would take the max from the step. And we were using 5-minute steps back then. But I found for the Submax, smaller steps, 10-minute, you're going to get a much better reading. Okay. Now, similar thing here. Now we have a full profile, and it's a run profile. So these are 5-minute steps. I just want to show you something to compare. So on this step, 14 kilometers per hour, the heart rate response was 155. Okay. So with 5-minute steps at 14, 140. So there's a big difference in heart rate response. And these tests were done relatively close together. They're 4 weeks apart. So the heart rate kinetics with a 10-minute step are very different than the kinetics with a 5-minute step. You just need to be aware of that because you might not necessarily be comparing like for like with when you're using the Submax versus the full profile. Nice thing with the full profile, though, is it gives us a good look at the top of the curve. And I went all the way to a 5.0 effort, lactate up at 7.6. I know from my own background that as I get more fit, I should be able to get into double figures, but it wasn't going to happen that day. So something to bear in mind there. Now for these higher zones, John did this plot of this data table here. John did this plot, and it's really easy to see what we're talking about. So we have the baseline kind of moving along there, and then it starts to tick up, and then we can see this slope change as well once I hit 160 beats per minute there. And so dialing in threshold and my zones is going to be relatively straightforward. They're going to mirror the subjective perception. Then I look at the heart rate response as well. And then I can also compare for those upper zones. I can compare to specific race data as well as more intense sets that I do to help dial them in further. All right. Spot checks in the field. We already talked about that one. The fatigue paradox. This is very important for you to know. Now, one of the things that you will find with yourself and with other athletes that you might be working with is that fatigue as well as glycogen depletion may appear as improved fitness. And what I mean by that is the pace and the power and the lactate are going to reduce, which is, so actually for a given pace or a given power, the lactate's going to reduce and the heart rate's going to reduce. And so in a Submax test, it may look like the athlete is becoming more fit. And what I mean by that is if the athlete used to need to do 130 beats per minute to produce 200 watts, then we test the athlete again, and all of a sudden they only need 120 beats per minute to produce the same power. We'd be like, wow, they got much more efficient. But one of the catches is that if this athlete is fatigued or depleted, When the athlete seeks to do zone 4 or zone 5 training, their RPE is going to go up very quickly, and they're not going to be able to achieve their normal maximum heart rate and maximum lactate values. This is a really important sign to pay attention to. They need rest and they need to eat because they're depleted. They might need nutritional consulting. It could be a sign of low energy availability within their overall program. So watch for that. I've experienced this with myself, and I was training well and I was racing well, but I was quite lean and I was quite fatigued. So I had the depletion and the fatigue going for me. You don't want to hang out there. Why? Because if you're in this state and you do a bunch of red zone training, it is really easy to tip yourself over the edge. It's maladaptive stress. So it's a good sign. You've done enough work. Just back off, freshen yourself up, and get your top end back. Do a full profile where you can crush it, and then you'll know that you're back on track. You hit those max heart rates, those max powers, and max paces again. All right. Common lactate profiles. I'm going to show you some curves that you're likely to see. Normal curve, steep curve, linear curve, and flat curve. Okay, so let's start. We mentioned earlier, we ran through the normal curve with my elite profile, and you've got the flat baseline, then the linear portion, then it kind of kicks up. Sometimes you can see it really easily. Sometimes you can't, just the way it is. What you're going to see most often is this C here, linear curve. So basically when the athlete starts, when lactate starts rising, it just keeps rising in a linear fashion. What that can mean is you started the test too high. So the power and the pace that you selected were too high. And a lot of amateurs want to start that test relatively high. Sometimes a lot of labs do too, so be aware of that. Don't be afraid to start it ridiculously easy. And by ridiculously easy, I mean, when I started out, I was going 100 watts under where I thought LT1 might be, just to get a nice long warm up and to make sure that I'm able to see that first lactate threshold, which I think is the most important point to pick up in this test. If you are a linear athlete, if you are coaching a linear athlete, focus on green zone, getting the athlete strong, technical improvement. What you're going to find is that anything in zone 3 or higher, the athlete will rapidly decouple. They will get very tired, and it's not worth it. So you got to just suck it up like I did in my metabolic manifesto. And you got to just go easy for as long as it takes to broaden that green zone and give yourself something to work with in an endurance sense. Next type of curve, steep curve. So this is basically what you'll see with a very well-trained elite. So this baseline, what they've done is their aerobic training is flattened. So if you see the green line here, it's flattened until we get close to LT2, and then the thing just takes off like a rocket ship. If you get a steep curve, that's what you're shooting for. Tick the box. It's all marginal gains from there. You flatten the curve as much as you can, and you're working with a very, very fit athlete at that stage. Now, I mentioned the lactate paradox with this flat curve, and this is what it's going to look like. So you'll have the athlete's normal profile, and then you'll run into a test where all of a sudden this athlete, it looks like they're fitter. So the curve is shifted down, but there's no top end. They just flame out, the legs load up, and they're like, I don't know what's up. I just don't have it today. I had one of these, or I thought I might have had one of these a month ago. And I pay a lot of attention to this now because I used to ignore it when I was younger. And I had a bunch of maladaptive stress. It didn't work for me. So pay attention to that. In a sense, it's a good sign. It means you've done enough. You got to back off, and you got to make sure you're eating enough because if your top end's gone, you're not doing yourself any favors. You're just running yourself down. Okay. Now, test frequency. Very common question. Submax testing and spot testing, do it all the time. I'm curious what's going on. And if I'm doing a long climb and I want to see what's happening. And I'm trying to ride to watts, but if you're riding to watts, remember you got this range. And I want to see what's up. So I'll do the baseline and the spot checks. I might do that once a week on a long aerobic climb just to kind of see where I'm at. Likewise, if I think my LT1 is moved, Submax test. It's a nice workout in itself. It's not going to tire me out. If I get sick, I'm going to want to retest once I've gotten rid of the illness, because quite often if it was a longer block, my LT1 will have shifted down and I'll need comfort to back off. And then 4 weeks after that return to training, I want to retest to confirm that I'm back on my normal zones. Now, for the full profile test, it can be quite fatiguing. And if you're a triathlete, you're going to be doing full profiles in say all your sports. If you do a whole bunch of testing, that's going to be maybe more red zone work than you want. I believe it's more red zone work than you need. So I would recommend you give yourself 8 to 10 weeks at the beginning of the season. So in other words, you've got yourself up and running. You've had at least 2 months of normal training. You've done your Submax testing, and now you want to have a look at what the full profile is. That's a great time to test. Another good time to test at the end of your general preparation, your base block. Maybe you're thinking about doing some faster work, incorporating some red zone training, or you just want to have another look at that full profile. Great time to test. And then final situation as a safety check and to get an idea what your zone 5 is before you do any intensive training block. Again, green light yourself, but also gather some data for the top end of your range so you can better target your intensive training. Okay, that's a wrap. Hey, I hit you with a lot. If you've got any further questions, just let us know. We'll do our best to answer. Thanks for listening.